But this week, I wanted to delve into something very specific, and that is James Murphy's decision to break up LCD Soundsystem at their peak, how that led into the farewell show at Madison Square Garden, and then, of course, their eventual decision to come back and reform the band for a new album a few years later. Crucially, I wanted to try and come at it from a historical angle and see what exactly James Murphy, the other members of LCD, and the press actually said about it at the time. Because I don't know about you, Ollie, but I feel like so much gets said about LCD's split, what the MSG gig was all about, whether Murphy was motivated by money or something cynical.
It becomes a bit of a quagmire at the end. It's impossible to work anything out.
Absolutely. So today I thought, let's take it back to 2009, and then afterwards we can analyse what we actually think about it all. So, to begin, I think it's worth remembering just how tenuous the whole idea of LCD Soundsystem as a band was in the first place. James Murphy said frequently that he didn't think, or doesn't think of LCD as a real band at all. They were his studio project that he would release via Death From Above, and then LCD would come together to cover that album live. I mean, there's a quote where he talks about them being the world's best cover band, right? No, anyway, before even the announcement of this is happening had come out, there were murmurs that Sound of Silver might be their last record. Like NME published an article in November 2008 to that effect. But then later in 2009, Murphy confirmed that This Is Happening was going to be released. And then once again, rumours started to emerge that this third record would be their last one. And if I'm honest, Murphy definitely encouraged this idea from the start. He did an interview with Rolling Stone where he said, I feel like this should be the last record. A lot of people make 3 good records and then they don't make good records anymore. If we get any bigger than we are, I would lose some interest. I feel like I made a band that was about how I felt about music, as an argument. I feel like I've explained myself and it's time to do something else. So Murphy in interview frequently made reference to bands like U2, The Cure, Talking Heads, R.E.M., who he thinks all made too many albums, or like seemed to drastically decrease in quality after their third record. But I just want to make this clear. All of this dialogue and the conversation was taking place long before the MSG show happened. But since the plans for breaking up had already been laid, when it came to booking Madison Square Garden, kind of the most iconic of New York venues, this is the home of the New York Knicks, the home of boxing, the Mecca, James Murphy was basically frustrated by the show promoters' lack of faith that he'd be able to actually fill it out. They even suggested that Big Boy open for them, which is just the most bizarre thing ever.
Bit of a clash, that.
Yeah, I don't know who came up with that. But basically, Murphy says he officially pulled the trigger on breaking up the band as a result of a phone conversation. So there's a quote where he talks to Vulture and he says, behind that idea was the promoter's belief that we just weren't going to sell any tickets unless there was some extra element. So I got mad on the phone. I was like, well, how about it's our last fucking show? And I hung up the phone. Then I was like, I guess that'll be our last show then. Regardless, when it came to this Madison Square Garden gig, all of the indie world, all of the LCD fans were under the impression that this would be their last ever show. And obviously what a show it was. I urge everyone to go and watch the Shut Up and Play the Hits documentary. I think at least it captures kind of the euphoria, but then also the pathos of a band's final moments really well. It's actually quite emotional watching
some of the facial expressions of people in the crowd.
Like Donald Glover, who pops up.
Donald Glover, he looks like he's having a fun time.
Yeah, he did.
But by the end, there's people literally sobbing and just complete, like the lights have gone up and people just can't move. They're clearly just so kind of wrecked emotionally by the 3-hour show that they've just seen.
The thing that I always think of, it feels a bit like an elegy. It's like an elegy to the band. Which is what makes what happens next so interesting. I'm going to pass this over to you now, Ollie.
Yeah. So I mean, it's the big question, isn't it? If you've been in, one of the most successful rock bands of the decade, once that has ended, kind of where the heck do you go?
Yeah.
For James Murphy, it turned out there were quite a few avenues of exploration. So he opened a bar and a cafe in New York because he's a bit of a foodie, I guess would be an appropriate word. Launched his own coffee line called House of Good. He's acted and directed films. Obviously continued his own production career because he had production on the Arcade Fire album. Yeah. I think more interesting was he was involved in a project called Subway Symphony, which basically involved him trying to lobby to change the soundtrack of New York's subway system, which, Google that, it's fairly interesting. Another passion project, along with Too Many DJs, who are a DJ duo from Belgium, he designed a unique 50,000 watt vinyl only sound system called Despacio, and this is kind of toured around America and Europe, and the size makes it an absolute logistical nightmare. Apparently they just lose money every time they try and move it somewhere. It was actually meant to be making a reappearance at London's Roundhouse this year, before COVID hit, obviously. If you're not missing clubs and sound systems, have a look on YouTube at some of the footage of that, because I guarantee you will be by the end. But whilst all these other projects were going on, Murphy found himself in a position where he had more songs than he knew what to do with. And it must have been incredibly confusing, because it's like, okay, do you launch a solo career and bring out a solo record, just James Murphy? Do you bring out an album but have to steer clear of musicians that you've worked with previously because you don't want it to be LCD Soundsystem? Yeah. Do you reform LCD Soundsystem?
Or do you just keep all the songs to yourself? Right?
Yeah, and go crazy, probably.
Yeah.
In the end, guidance came from quite an unlikely but quite an experienced source. Murphy was invited to collaborate by David Bowie on his final record, Black Star. And it was during this time that he sought some advice. And Bowie basically asked Murphy, does reforming the band make you uncomfortable? And Murphy said, yeah. Bowie said, good. It's a good thing you'll be uncomfortable.
That's interesting.
Because it'll make you work harder. And you know, as strange as it was, that this was David Bowie talking to James Murphy, you know, in Murphy's words, this guy seemed more like a god than a human being. This council kind of swung things, and basically there was a comeback gig announced at Coachella 2016, I think. And then the band went on a world tour the year after to basically promote American Dream, which we talked about earlier. But yeah, this certainly wasn't positive news for everybody. Like, it wasn't well received in all quarters. Some fans felt angered and betrayed by the news, with many arguing that it cheapened the Madison Square Garden show. This, like, you know, the
spectacle of that.
The spectacle of that. You know, the amount of money that tickets were exchanging for was absolutely bonkers. But yeah, people kind of felt taken advantage of, and they viewed the band with this like mercenary mindset. You know, announce you're disbanding to like sell the tickets, and then reform 5 years later at Coachella of all places.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's quite a long odyssey that we've just tried to run through. Having charted their story from then to now, after the Reformation, where do you stand with everything, Jamie?
Well, first of all, I think the money thing, this idea that they're mercenary, or they like sold out, or they you know, disbanded the band just to sell out Madison Square Garden for the money. Like, I think that's just like patently false. Like, it's not a valid criticism. So it turns out they didn't make any money off that show. Like, Al Doyle, who's the guitarist in LCD, also in Hot Chip, he put out some tweets where he basically explains that the show, to quote here, lost a lot of money. If you bought a ticket for $1,000 and then arrived by helicopter, you might still have made more money than we did that night. So that's how he puts it in perspective. The thing that upsets me slightly is just how they seem to have undercut, or Murphy seems to have undercut, what could have been just the most perfect of endings. A trilogy of albums, each one better than the last, ending on the track Home. You can't really get much better than that, can you? And then, you know, as Murphy points out as well in interviews, almost zero bands quit while they're ahead, unless like someone dies or the band splits acrimoniously. It's just so hard to do. And that Madison Square Garden gig has a decade of indie music that couldn't probably be better surmised by that set of songs. And that to me would have been one of the most perfect endings to any band I can think of. And to kind of like throw that away, to undercut that, to make American Dream, that's why I'm kind of like, it kind of grates me slightly.
The thing is, I get what you're saying. I understand how that can vex, because I know exactly what you mean, and that if it had just been Coachella, that would have rankled with me big time, because it would that
would have been disgusting.
It would have been horrendous. But you know, the fact that they toured around the world, they brought out a new album that Murphy clearly really, really believed in. I'm kind of like, okay, there's more to it here than just, you know, it's not just about money, as you say. It is patently false. What I would say is, when I heard that American Dream was coming out, I remember being filled with a kind of crippling terror. And I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah, I was dreading it as well.
I remember thinking, this is going to ruin their reputation, it's going to ruin their legacy. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad album. It's nowhere near as good, in my eyes, as Sound of Silver and This Is Happening, but it certainly doesn't like tarnish their reputation.
It's not a disgrace, is it, by any means?
But what I think is, okay, maybe that has slightly tarnished this perfect ending that they had, because it wasn't on that level. But I think if they continue to make music and could hopefully get back to the level of Sound of Silver or This Is Happening or even their debut, then could you not make an argument that it's been somewhat worth it? Well,
I mean, I guess the thing I'd say to that is then, like, if that was the case, why not just go on hiatus? And I think the reason they didn't is because it's just like, it's indicative of James Murphy's personality, and we love him, so I feel like I'm allowed to kind of speak slightly negatively about certain aspects of his personality. Obviously, he's defined by like overthinking things. He is that guy. He overthinks everything. He's so preoccupied with his image, how he's going to be perceived, how every little action of this band and every little lyric is going to be taken, and he's so desperate to explain himself and make sure people understand what he's trying to say. I mean, after he reformed the band and people and his fans were angry that he'd cheapened the Madison Square Garden farewell, which is something he didn't consider. You know, he's quoted as saying, like, for the rest of my life, no matter what happens in this band, we will never break up again. One day we'll stop making music, but no one is going to say a fucking word about it ahead of time. He realises, I think, deep down, James Murphy realises that he didn't handle the situation perhaps as well as he could have. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess as far as I see it, there's almost a perfect way of summing this up, having just mentioned this aspect of James Murphy's personality, which is from a quote again from Chuck Klosterman. Speaking about James Murphy, he says, "The idea of putting this much effort and thought into the alleged conclusion of your band does sort of illustrate a key characteristic of New York music from that period, which was hyper self-awareness. Everything was considered, and he, James Murphy, was the most considered of that." I think that sums it up pretty well.
Pretty perfectly.